Libido Dominandi by E. Michael Jones. All rights reserved to E. Michael Jones. Part 2, Chapter 4, Greenwich Village, 1913. The year 1913 was an annus mirabilis of sorts. The year before the Great War was the year during which modernity surfaced, and it can only be compared with 1921, the year when The Wasteland and Ulysses appeared, the year when the forces of dissolution freed by the war's dislocation of mores and morals began to be implemented on a wide scale. It was during 1913 that John B. Watson gave his lecture on behaviorism at Columbia University, in competition with Henry Bergson, who was speaking downtown. But the paradigmatic event of that year was the Armory Show, which introduced New York and America to the trends which would dominate the art world after the war. The most famous picture at the Armory Show was Marcel Duchamp's, quote, nude descending a staircase, end quote, an importation of the Cubist techniques which Braque and Picasso had developed, but which one American perceived as an explosion in a shingle factory. Plato said that changes in musical form presaged changes in the state. The same could be said of painting. Cubism was, of course, a revolt against morals, but the new form was so bewildering that few people understood it as such. The few who did live in Greenwich Village and felt that the rest of New York, the city above 14th Street, was, quote, cut off from the village, like the ego from the id, end quote. The comparison gives some indication of how Freud's theories took America's Bohemia by storm during the first decade of the 20th century. As perhaps the opening shot in the publicity campaign that would make Freudian terminology part of the cultural lingua franca by the 1920s, Max Eastman wrote 2 long articles on Freud in 1915 in Everybody's Magazine, which at the time had a circulation of 600,000 readers. Eastman, who would go on to become a communist and then an anti-communist, described psychoanalysis as a new treatment, quote, which I believe may be valued to hundreds of thousands of people, end quote. A method for dissecting out, quote, mental cancers, which will leave you sound and free and energetic, end quote. The one thing Eastman never abandoned was his sexual libertinism, and before long it became clear that this was the force driving the acceptance of Freud's theory of psychoanalysis among the Bohemians in Greenwich Village. In 1916, fellow radical Floyd Dell, also associated with Eastman on the editorial board at the Masses, went into psychoanalysis. He would later say that, quote, everyone at the time who knew about psychoanalysis was a sort of missionary on the subject, and nobody could be around Greenwich Village without hearing a lot about it, end quote. Dell's psychoanalysis was Samuel A. Tannenbaum, an early proponent of sexual liberation who felt that sexual abstinence was psychologically dangerous. Tannenbaum also advocated the legalization of prostitution, feeling that if young men frequented prostitutes, they would dissipate dangerous amounts of, quote, frustrated excitement, end quote. Another early convert to the gospel of Freud was a young journalist by the name of Walter Lippmann, a man who would later be called, quote, the prophet of the new liberalism, end quote. Reading Freud was for Lippmann an almost religious experience, something significant for someone who did not believe in religion, organized or otherwise. Lippmann, the young Harvard graduate, when searching for the epiphany which might be commensurate to the discovery of Freud, could only compare it to the feeling his father's generation might have felt on discovering Darwin. In 1914, Lippmann was named associate editor of the New Republic, the flagship of the new liberalism, and with this new journal as his platform, Lippmann and his friend Alfred Booth Kuttner, one of the first people to be psychoanalyzed by Freud's American student A. Brill, began to pump out flattering accounts of Freud's new theory. Freudianism, through Lippmann, would become a constitutive part of American liberalism, as well as one of the intellectual constructs Lippmann would use to analyze social problems. Lippmann also brought the Freudian gospel to Mabel Dodge salons, where it quickly spread further among the intellectuals there. Dodge was so taken with the new theories as a possible explanation of her own bisexual behavior that she immediately began analysis with Brill. Brill, a man with his own set of sexual compulsions and a penchant for smutty jokes, was, if anything, more forthright than Freud when it came to advocacy of sexual liberation. Quote, "With a normal sexual life," end quote, he is quoted as saying in a Lippmann article, quote, "there is no such thing as a neurotic," end quote. This excuse for sexual indulgence was just what the boho crowd in the village wanted to hear. And during the second decade of the 20th century, Freud's ideas were adopted by them as their own. According to one observer, Freudian theory, which implicitly encouraged sexual freedom, became a wedge used to, quote, "to liberate American literature from pruderies and other social restrictions." It may well be that the freedom to write about sex, which was linked with other freedoms, would have been won without the intervention of Freud. But the literary exploitation of Freud was a heavy reinforcement at a decisive moment, and materially assisted the coming of age of our literature. End quote. Right around the time of the Armory show, a 21-year-old by the name of Eddie Bernays had, at the urging of a friend, taken over the editorship of an obscure journal known as the Medical Review of Reviews. Eddie had always had a perceptive ear for what people were saying, and perhaps because the Freudian id was successfully seeping uptown from the village, sex was on the people's mind. And Eddie saw an opportunity to make money out of it. Eddie understood the words of one New York editor who announced on March 15, 1913, that it was, quote, "sex o'clock in America," end quote. In the early months of 1913, Bernays received a review of a play called Damaged Goods. Written by the French playwright Eugene Briot, Damaged Goods told the story of a man who contracts syphilis, then marries, then fathers a syphilitic child. The review was a frontal attack on the sensibilities of the time and perceived as such by the magazine's conservative audience. Far from being a coward by the reaction, Bernays approached an actor who had indicated a desire to produce the play, pledging the magazine's support. Quote, "The editors of the Medical Review of Reviews," end quote, Bernays wrote to Richard Bennett, quote, "support your praiseworthy intention to fight sex purency in the United States by producing your play Damaged Goods. You can count on our help," end quote. Bernays was so gratified by Bennett's favorable response that he immediately agreed to underwrite the costs of the production, an ambitious undertaking for someone who was making $25 a week. Bernays understood intuitively that there was a market for sexual liberation, and that he could tap that market financially by turning the play into a cause célèbre. Damaged Goods could stand for freedom of expression on sexual matters, and in order to make his point he began to enlist the support of a group of influential New Yorkers who shared his point of view. One of the first people to come on board the Medical Review of Reviews Sociological Fund Committee to help in the fight against prudery was John D. Rockefeller, Jr., who explained to the young Bernays that, quote, "the evils springing from prostitution cannot be understood until frank discussion of them has been made possible," end quote. Hundreds of checks poured in from people like the Rockefellers and Mr. and Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Eddie was on his way to becoming, as he would call himself later, in what would prove to be a very long life, he died at the age of 103, quote, "the father of public relations," end quote. Eddie Bernays had parlayed his interest in sex into the creation of the First Front Group and a career that would ride the crest of the advertising and public relations wave that would break over the United States, transforming the country into what it came to be today. The Front Group, as a technique for manipulating public opinion who dominate cultural life during the 20th century, and the subterfuge whereby economic interest would camouflage its manipulation would become increasingly sophisticated, to the point where, quote, today it takes a detective to unmask the interests behind such innocuous-sounding groups as the Safe Energy Communication Council, anti-nuclear, the Eagle Alliance, pro-nuclear, and the Coalition Against Regressive Taxation, trucking industry, end quote. Quote, it all started with sex, end quote, Eddie would say, describing his remarkable career. If so, the beginning was not auspicious financially. As soon as Bennett acquired the rights to the play, he told Bernays to get lost. Quote, I don't need your damn astrological fund anymore, end quote. He wrote to Bernays. Not one to brood, Bernays decided that the money he hadn't earned was ancillary to the lessons about manipulating public opinion which he had learned, and so in the summer of 1913 he decided to escort a young man to Europe to talk over the psychological implications of what he had learned with his uncle. His decision was not based simply on familial ties. Eddie Bernays' uncle was Sigmund Freud. The details of their conversation as the 21-year-old Bernays tramped through the woods surrounding Carlsbad in what was soon to be called Czechoslovakia, with his by then famous 57-year-old uncle, has been lost to posterity. The general tenor of their conversation, however, was clear. Bernays had made the first foray into manipulating the public mind by appealing to its sexual interests, and since his uncle was famous as an authority on sex, Eddie wanted to know what he knew so he could apply it to the masked man. Quote, whatever the specifics of their conversation, end quote, writes Ty, quote, it is clear that when Eddie returned to New York in the fall of 1913, he was more taken than ever with the Viennese doctor's novel theories on how unconscious drives dating to childhood make people act the way they do, and Eddie was convinced that understanding the instincts and symbols that motivate an individual could help him shape the behavior of the masses, end quote. In trying to understand the intellectual connection between Eddie and his famous uncle, Ty is hampered, unfortunately, by certain misconceptions about Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis. Quote, Bernays' ideas, end quote, Ty tells us, quote, reflected the profound influence of his uncle Sigmund. He talked about the use of symbols, as Freud did, and of the centrality of, quote, stereotypes, individual and community, that will bring favorable responses, end quote. He was as driven as his uncle to know what subconscious forces motivated people, and he used Freud's writings to help him understand. But while the esteemed analyst tried to use psychology to free his patients from emotional crutches, Bernays used it to rob consumers of their free will, helping his clients predict, then manipulate, the very way their customers thought and acted, all of which he openly acknowledged in his writings, end quote. At another point, Ty repeats the same misconception of Freud. Quote, Bernays is a philosopher, not a mere businessman. He is a nephew of that other great philosopher, Dr. Sigmund Freud. Unlike his distinguished uncle, he is not known as a practicing psychoanalyst, but he is a psychoanalyst just the same, for he deals with the science of unconscious mental processes. His business is to treat unconscious mental acts by conscious ones. The great Viennese doctor is interested in releasing the pent-up libido of the individual. His American nephew is engaged in releasing and directing the suppressed desires of the crowd, end quote. And again, in the same vein, Ty claims that, quote, while Freud sought to liberate people from their subconscious drives and desires, Eddie sought to exploit those passions, end quote. As with James Jones, in his analysis of the relationship between Kinsey and the Rockefeller interests, Ty proposes a dichotomy where none exists. Eddie Bernays did not have a different goal in mind when he proposed exploiting sexual passion for financial gain. Bernays' uncle Sigmund, as the case of Horace Frink makes clear, had been doing this for some time. In fact, even Freud himself admitted that psychoanalysis wasn't really medicine. In his more candid moments with his friend and confidant Wilhelm Fliess, Freud referred to patients as, quote, goldfish, end quote, and, quote, Negroes, end quote, making it clear that psychoanalysis was a form of psychic control for the financial benefit of the analyst. The transaction was quite simple, and transacted many times in places like Greenwich Village. In exchange for permission to gratify his sexual passions, the patient would receive, quote, absolution, end quote, from the psychoanalyst, acting as crypto-confessor for the financial consideration. Bernays and his famous uncle were both involved in exploiting sexual passion for financial gain. The only difference was the medium the younger man chose. Freud bilked his patients individually in psychoanalytic sessions. Bernays tried to manipulate the country collectively through the mass media by means of advertising and public relations. In both instances, the technique was pure Illuminism, something which Bernays makes clear in his writings, specifically his 1928 magnum opus, Propaganda, where he tells us that, quote, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons, a trifling fraction of our 120 million, who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses, end quote. America was now ruled by a group of, quote, invisible governors, end quote, composed of PR professionals like Bernays, who, quote, pull the wires which control the public mind, who harness old forces and contrive new ways to bind and guide the world, end quote. These, quote, invisible governors, end quote, were necessary to, quote, the orderly functioning of group life, end quote. In fact, the, quote, invisible governors helped to bring order out of chaos, end quote. Democratic man, in other words, needed control as soon as he was liberated. End of Part 2, Chapter 4, Libido Dominandi, by E. Michael Jones.